Morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world, from a warm and sunny New Zealand. And welcome to the second in the VOX-Pol lecture series. Today, we're fortunate to have the very highly regarded Berger talking to us about the thorny topic of conceptualizing extremism online. So it should be a fascinating discussion. JM, of course, is a well-known researcher and consultant focused on extremism, propaganda, and misinformation, both online and offline. He is, of course, a research fellow with VOX-Pol and is currently a PhD candidate at Swansea University School of Law, where he studies extremist ideologies and participates as an expert for the Cyber Threats Research Centre. JM is also the author of 4 books. I won't go through those, but I can highly recommend them. I have read 3 of them, and they're a great read. But he's also written extensively about malicious activity on social media. In addition to his academic work, though, JM consults for technology companies and government agencies on issues related to homegrown terrorism, online extremism, foreign fighters, disinformation, and advanced techniques for social media analysis. He is a former member of the Independent Advisory Committee at GIFCT and is a former non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution and a contributor to The Atlantic as well. So it's a real pleasure to have JM here this afternoon. As we go through the presentation, if you do have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A box, and I will facilitate those at the end of James' presentation. So welcome, JM. Great to have you here. I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. So I am going to talk about conceptualizing extremism. We're going to start with a little bit of definitional discussion and then sort of plunge into some of the implications of that, why definitions are important. If you've seen me talk before, you may have heard some of these points before, but I am constantly updating and revising and adding new material to this. So stick with me. If it starts to sound a little familiar, I promise there'll be some more interesting, more novel stuff at the end. So I'm going to put a slideshow up. Looks like that worked. So the devil in the details. So basically, I always sort of start off with this image. It's like, extremism. This is what we understand to be extremism. And I used to go to a collection of historical figures for the second slide, but I'm doing something a little more contemporary this time, which is raising the question of where we draw the line about how we define extremist movements. So extremists on the fringe, like ISIS and neo-Nazis, we have become, I think, very comfortable with analyzing those and studying them and making policies about them. And where we, I think, have to really examine our assumptions and make some adjustments is in considering the possibility that extremism is not just on the fringe, that extremism can exist in the center of a society. And so to enter into that consideration, to ask whether this mob of January 6th in the United States, it's pictured on the left, or whether some of the world leaders pictured on the right, who are the image you're seeing here is an advertisement for a far-right summit that's happening in Spain shortly. You can see that we have several heads of state here. We have people who maybe wouldn't be considered extremists in some circles, and people who would be more commonly considered extremists in other circles. But all of these questions of who's into that group, who's out of that group, I would argue are very important. So what we're going to do in this talk is first, we're going to take a look at how extremism is defined in the academic literature and some of the policy literature. We're going to examine the most common types of definitions. And then we're going to examine an alternative definition, which is the one that I've been advancing. I'll talk a little bit about why I think that works better for our current moment in history. We're going to look at a case study, which is going to be the example of racial slavery in the United States, which is something that is not often considered to be extremist, by students of extremism. In fact, some of the leading scholars on extremism have argued with me quite vigorously about whether racial slavery can be considered an extremist ideology. And I will argue that it is, and I will talk a little bit about why. So that brings us to a discussion of power dynamics in extremism studies. And so, you know, what is the difference between an extremist movement that lives on the fringe versus an extremist movement that's capturing the center of a society or has captured it? And how are those how do those differences affect how we study them? And, you know, how can we frame our discussions so that we can follow a movement from a point of powerlessness through, you know, potentially having absolute power in a society? The question is whether these movements change in nature because one point in time it's powerless and another point in time it's powerful. And then finally, we'll talk about how all these decisions have application in the real world, and particularly for academia, for us who study it, for the technology companies, where this is really a crucial, very difficult and important issue about how this stuff plays out online and how we're going to take steps to deal with it online. And then finally, how government policies can be shaped by this. So we're going to start with a few definitions out of the literature. So, and in my dissertation, which is a work in progress, my literature review really looks at a wide range of definitions, and there are a number of different approaches to defining extremism, but the most common by far is reflected in the examples we're going to look at right here. So Nurolev in 2002 wrote that extremism is adherence to extreme views and actions which radically diverge from social norms and rules. Corlin and Bartoli use one that I quote very frequently, defining extremism as activities and beliefs that are far removed from the ordinary. So extremism is outside of the ordinary, the mainstream. And some of our other authors here will get even more concrete about what they mean by the ordinary here. So Kruglanski et al. Arguing that extremism is motivated deviance from general behavioral norms. Peter Neumann arguing that political ideologies that oppose a society's core values and principles are what constitutes extremism. Weber says deviancy from a general pattern of behavior or attitude that prevails in a given social context. So all of these definitions are really predicated on an idea that extremism is, that the extreme part of extremism is defined as its extreme deviance from the center of a society. And while you can understand where this comes from, it creates troubling problems when we're really thinking about how we study extremism, how we look at these problems, and how we're going to define our field. So for instance, if you look at, you know, my favorite example for this is if you look at the Nazi Party in the 1920s, the Nazi Party was a fringe movement. It falls into these definitions of extremism, that extremism is deviation from general norms. In the 1930s, the Nazis begin to capture a plurality of German society. In the 1940s, they capture all of German political structure and much of German society. By the 1950s, they've lost all that again. So the question is, did the Nazis change in a substantive way, so much so that we're going to change the category that we study them in? Did the Nazis start as extremists, become something different in the middle, and then stop being extremists after they lost? And I would argue that they did not. I would argue that it's inherently the same kind of movement responding to different environmental cues. So how do we define extremism if we're not going to go with this idea that it's a deviation from the general norms? So in my book, Extremism, and in, you know, many talks and papers before and since that book came out, I have been arguing that the best way to think about extremism is that it's the belief that an in-group success is inseparable from hostile action against an out-group. So I'm using the language of social identity theory here. The in-group is not the in-group as in the cool group or the dominant group. The in-group is simply the group to which you belong. And the out-group is people who are excluded from that group. So, you know, if you believe that the group to which you belong cannot be healthy or successful without taking hostile action against an outgroup, then that makes you an extremist. It is, the hostile action is inseparable here. So the concept is not simply that you are responding to a situational need where there's, you know, a particular threat. There's a, you know, we obviously see war and conflict of all kinds happen in the world, and not everything is extremism. It's when you believe that your group's intrinsic health and success cannot be separated from taking hostile action against an outgroup, that hostile action is part of your definition of health and success. That makes you an extremist movement. So I will also just put as a term here, radicalization is a highly contested term, as is extremism itself. In my view, radicalization means the adoption of increasingly negative views about an outgroup or outgroups, and the endorsement of increasingly harmful actions against the same. So, you know, a lot of definitions of extremism are rightfully criticized for being vague or difficult to, you know, implement in a useful way, difficult to make a categorization, or sometimes it's just a demonization term. You just say somebody's becoming radicalized if you don't like the direction that their views are going. So this is a hopefully more specific kind of way to think about it. There's a kind of barometer here. We see extremism as a spectrum, radicalization is movement up the spectrum, and de-radicalization, which can happen, is movement down the spectrum, where you adopt less negative views, and you prescribe less harmful actions against the outgroup. So I'll just show this because I may throw some of these terms around as we're talking about this. And this chart is based on the work of Haroro Ingram and has been iterated somewhat by me in subsequent publications. It's the extremist value proposition, or the extremist system of meaning. So the extremist value proposition argues that the eligible in-group, what I call the eligible in-group, which means the broad identity to which you're appealing, is being negatively affected by a crisis. That crisis is being caused by an outgroup, and an extremist in-group arises to argue that the solution to the crisis is to take hostile action against the outgroup. So in this case, you know, if we're talking about white nationalism, the eligible in-group would be white people, and the extremist in-group would be neo-Nazis, for instance. The solution would be genocide, potentially, or terrorism against an outgroup, which would be non-white people. And the crisis can be formulated in all kinds of different ways. And we've seen in the favorite, obviously, white nationalist circles as kind of conspiracy theories about outgroups suppressing or controlling outcomes for white people. So I think it's one thing that, you know, is important to make this distinction between the eligible in-group and the extremist in-group, because it helps us to understand first the mechanics by which an extremist in-group is recruiting, who its audience is, who it's speaking to in any given moment. And also it helps us to distinguish between people who are not in our in-group. So if we're talking about, if you are a student of terrorism and you are a white Westerner who's from a Christian background, and you are talking about terrorism in the Middle East, if you conflate the eligible in-group Muslims with an extremist in-group like ISIS, then that is arguably an extremist belief in yourself. It's important to keep this distinction in mind. The extremist in-group is constantly trying to win over the eligible in-group for reasons that I will get into a little bit in this discussion. So I've done a lot of work, and you've all probably read a lot of work on current movements. For instance, jihadism. We've looked at Abdullah Azzam, for instance. I did an analysis of his work that will be part of my dissertation. Analysis of his ideological writings. We look at Osama bin Laden, we look at Said Qutb, we look on the white nationalist side, we look at Mein Kampf, we look at Siege, I think, is a paper that I wrote about very recently for the Resolve Network. I did an analysis of the content of Siege. by James Mason, which is the underlying ideological text for the Atomwaffen movement and related siege culture movements. And we don't talk about other historical examples that have purchase in society. And so one in particular that I'm interested in as an American and as a student of extremism is the case of racial slavery in the United States. So slavery was part of the United States before there was a United States. It took place in the colonies. It was not enshrined exactly in the Constitution, but it was by virtue of omission for the most part permitted by the US Constitution at its founding. And then the United States slowly started to turn away from slavery during the 19th century. So as a status quo behavior, slavery originated with a conceptualization of profit. It was done to create labor. It was exploitative. It was not necessarily deeply ideological, although there are complex ideological underpinnings to it. But what happened in the United States in the first several decades is that slavery was an assumed practice. And as the rise of critics of abolitionists came along, who argued that slavery was not an acceptable practice, argued that it was a crime against humanity, the practitioners of slavery had to defend it. They had to defend the legitimacy of the practice. And so they created an incredible body of work, which Drew Faust in her book, The Ideology of Slavery, described as, taking on the characteristics of a formal ideology. So we had a situation at the start of the 19th century where slavery was the status quo. Slavery, the institution, came under attack, and therefore people had to write ideological texts to defend it. And as you can kind of see in this, probably suggested in this quote, they sought methodically to enumerate all possible foundations for human bondage, which means that they were throwing everything against the wall and seeing what stuck. So there's just a remarkable amount of output that happened in the 19th century. Writings that attempted to define some kind of racial science. They attempted to define a racial theology. There were economic arguments in favor of slavery. There were political arguments in favor of it. But most of the important texts in this time were really tackling racial difference through the lens of either science, and I'm doing air quotes. I don't know if you can see me doing that while the PowerPoint's up. Science or religion. I'm doing air quotes on both of those. So I looked at a lot of these texts as a part of a chapter in my dissertation, which is not yet published. And what you can see in the development of this material is a real sharp difference from what we see in contemporary fringe extremist movements. So the ideologies, the works that were written to defend and promote slavery are really strikingly different from a work like Siege. So Siege, which is, if for those of you who don't know, it is written by James Mason in the 1980s. It's a collection of articles from his neo-Nazi newsletter of the same name, and it's hundreds of pages of often very tedious reading. And the primary focus of Siege, when I actually sat down to analyze it, we think of a neo-Nazi kind of tract as going to be about how Jews and non-white people are bad. And in fact, it's mostly about how white people are bad. It's mostly a critique of the eligible in-group. The eligible in-group of white people is seen as complacent. It's seen as complicit in its own oppression. And so almost, the overwhelming focus of what Mason writes is to criticize those people in the eligible in-group who are not willing to adopt his view of racial difference. And it's relatively little as a verbiage question, as a word count question, there's relatively little said about outgroups in comparison to what's said about the in-group. So when we look at the slavery material, the ideology of slavery, and I looked at just a very large amount of material. I did a very deep dive on one long book called Studies on Slavery, and I looked at a lot of other material that sort of took a biblical approach or a pseudoscientific approach or sought to bridge them, as the works of Samuel Cartwright did. All of this material that was produced in this antebellum pre-Civil War era of the United States on the ideology of slavery is almost exclusively concerned with the outgroup. So it's a sharp contrast to what we see for Mason. Mason, as a fringe extremist, sees divisions within the in-group. He sees that most people in the in-group are not on his side, but that they have a lot of different views, and he wants to highlight those discrepancies. He wants to attack the people who are not hold the same racial views that he has, and he wants to highlight any weaknesses or flaws or inconsistencies he sees in there. He wants to disrupt and ultimately to tear down the existing white in-group power structure in order to replace it with something else that is more to his liking. That's why we call it accelerationism. Accelerationism comes from that critique of the white in-group. Now, in the slavery texts, what we see is a very different picture. Slavery ideological texts, pro-slavery ideological texts written in this early 19th century period are almost exclusively concerned with the outgroup. So they are phrenology. They are pseudoscience and phrenology that attempts to discuss the origins of the races. Some of them attempted to argue that Black people and white people had different racial origins, that they were actually completely different species. Others come up with a biblical explanation for why white people and Black people diverge after initially being created by God as the same species. And some, including the Studies on Slavery and Samuel Cartwright's work, combine those views. So they come up with a biblical explanation that creates two distinct races that then intermarry and become corrupt. The white race becomes corrupt. All of this discussion is about the outgroup. The focus is on Black people, the outgroup of the slaveholders. The slavery, is obviously the concept of slavery in the United States in the 19th century cannot be separated from race. So it is purely a racial construct. There are no white slaves in America. And there are very few free Black people in America, especially in the South. So all of this material is focused on racial difference, and it's focused on creating explanatory readings that say, here's why Black people should be slaves. And some of them are scientific, that they're trying to argue that Black people are genetically inclined to be docile, or I'm doing a lot of air quotes here, passive, and that they need white people to enlightened white people to guide them. Another set of these arguments is that biblical origin is that slavery was instituted by God as punishment for sins by people of Black complexion in early humanity. Without getting super deep into that, there's two strains of this. One's called the Curse of Ham. Some of you may be familiar with. The others stipulates the existence of human-like races prior to the birth of Adam. Some of the stuff gets pretty crazy. So all of this material, the important thing to remember about this is that it's all about the outgroup. There's almost no discussion of white people in these texts. And there is very little, even as this dispute was becoming quite heated, there's very little attempt to demonize or expel abolitionists from the white in-group. So one thing you see in Siege that's very different from these pro-slavery texts is James Mason in Siege and neo-Nazis in general are happy to banish somebody from the white in-group if they don't comply with what they believe is the proper way for white people to behave. You can be excommunicated, and we see this with ISIS as well. This is a very common thing with ISIS. ISIS has a whole theological branch devoted to this practice of takfir, which is excommunication. Muslims who don't support ISIS are disqualified from being Muslims. You don't see any of that in this status quo dominant strain. And so that's a real difference. When you are, the existing status quo is slavery in the United States in the 19th century. And therefore, we're not trying to mobilize supporters, we are trying to demobilize dissent. So the fringe group is focused on in-group policing. It's focused on saying who's got the purity, who's going to pass the purity test, who's, you know, the right-thinking white person, who's the right-behaving white person. The dominant group, the pro-slavery ideologists, is focused on out-group policing. So it's all about how the people in the out-group behave, what they do, and why it's important for the in-group to take action against them. Similarly, the fringe group is focused on mobilizing support. It's trying to find people who are going to be true believers. It's trying to find the most fanatical and dedicated people who are going to step up and make things happen. Because the dominant strain is the status quo, it doesn't need to mobilize support. It's there already. It owns the space. It owns the battlefield. And what it wants to do is demobilize dissent. So a lot of these writings in the pro-slavery ideological oeuvre are really focused on, you know, this is the way it is and you shouldn't fight it. We shouldn't be arguing about this. You should just stay home. And so they're often not even really that focused on selling a belief, an ideological belief, so much as just keeping people from getting engaged with the fight. The thing that unites all of these strains of argument is that they're all targeting in-group consensus. So in-group consensus is essentially how we understand reality. And you can see, you know, we see a lot of people talking about, for instance, in the COVID era, we talk about vaccines, you know, vaccine hesitancy versus vaccine denial versus vaccine acceptance. And we can see in a lot of this that the group of people who you associate with, you see as your in-group, dictate what you believe about this. And this is ultimately the way we all function in society. The social construction of reality is a concept that's been put forward for some years now, and it argues that we determine what's real through in-group consensus. So if you are out there in the world, you are constantly encountering things that you can't know the truth of. Perhaps you don't have the specialized training, you're not a doctor, you can't decide about vaccines, or, you know, any number of other things. Any time you sort of run into something that has uncertainty associated with it, you need to check with your peers to see what they think, and that helps you understand what you think about reality. So here's my meme version of this. In-groups are key arbiters of what's real. So and it's really, this is an existential concept, right? So this is the most important thing in any person's life, is understanding what's real. And when you are part of an in-group and everybody in-group agrees on the same basic reality, then that's stable and you feel comfortable and you feel safe and you feel protected. And if your in-group encounters a different group, an out-group that has different beliefs about what's real, about what's true and what's real, you have to resolve that somehow. And so social construction of reality is really an extended discussion of how that happens. But we're going to sort of condense that all because, you know, we only have so much time today. But, you know, ultimately, what this boils down to is when uncertainty happens, things happen, huge disruptions to the status quo, disruptions to technology, science, economies. People feel uncertainty and they seek to resolve that uncertainty by aligning themselves with the in-group consensus. And when there's great uncertainty, or when a person is particularly prone to or vulnerable to uncertainty, they can get an unhealthy attachment to the in-group because they need that constant reassurance. And really, this is kind of the heart of where extremist impulses come from, in my opinion. So There's also a question of stable versus fluid. So, what we see in the ideology of slavery is that as beliefs about slavery became more fluid, challenges to legitimacy are mounted against the institution of slavery, and that leads to a dramatic escalation in the amount of ideological content defending slavery. We can also see this in kind of the splintering and fringe movements. I sort of came up with, developed this understanding looking at more fringe kinds of movements, where you can see that a lot of ideological texts are written in response to challenges to legitimacy. They invoke scholars, they invoke authority figures, historical texts, religious beliefs, all seeking to respond to critics. And you can see that response to critics is embedded in, if you read Siege, if you read Join the Caravan by Abdullah Azzam, if you read the writings of Christian identity over the course of many years, as I did for one paper, you can see again and again that a lot of ideological texts are written as explicit responses to critics, who are generally critics who are part of the eligible in group. People in the eligible in group don't understand. And so when they don't understand, you have to explain it to them. And when you're explaining it to them, you have to come up with more and more elaborate reasons if they don't respond. So you keep elaborating on the ideology, you keep adding dimensions to it, and in the process it often becomes more and more extreme. It radicalizes. So movements that are in transition, whether they're ascendant or declining, are particularly prone to escalation. So what you see is a movement that's starting to take over or has taken over. If you look at ISIS and the caliphate phase, you can see that, really the amount of violence and the amount of fanaticism, the negative views against the outgroup all escalate during that period. And movements in transition are ultimately seeking to reify their beliefs. So they're trying, reification is the process by which a belief or opinion becomes accepted as fact, as indisputable fact. And so extremist movements in a transitional phase, whether on the way up or the way down, they're seeking to reify beliefs about the in-group, reify beliefs about the out-group, and reify this prescription for a strategy. What is the hostile action that you need to take against an out-group? So there's a lot of, covered a lot of ground here. I hope I didn't rush through it too much. There's really, it's a big, intense kind of process of engagement with this material. And extremist ideologues are particularly verbose. So we read a lot of stuff from them, and we have to digest a lot of material. And so this is my attempt to sort of condense a lot of it, but I will be publishing much more detailed looks at it in the future. What are the implications of all this? So for academics, I think the thing we need to understand is that public opinion and social norms are extremely fickle and can change rapidly. So if we are defining extremism as far removed from the ordinary, or as a deviation from behavioral norms, or opposition to society's core values, that's not a durable category for us to study as academics, because groups like the Nazis will start off on the fringe and then slowly capture the center of society. And unless we want to stipulate that they stop being extremists when they capture the center, then we have to have a different definition. We can't define it based on its fringe activities. Another aspect of this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is that, this also far removed from the ordinary, deviance from behavioral norms can really describe a lot of groups that are not recognizably extremist to our common sense assessment. So for instance, Mormons in the United States, or let's say Buddhists in the United States, because there are only a tiny percentage of Americans are Buddhists. Does that make Buddhists extremists? Inherently extremists to be Buddhist? There are obviously Buddhist extremists, but it is not inherently extremist to be a Buddhist in the United States, even though it is far removed from the ordinary. So the key thing here, I think, from an academic perspective, is that these definitions frame and define extremism based on something other than the thing in itself. So we're defining extremism based on what other people think about it and what the society thinks about it. And we're basing our definition of extremism on the attitudes and behaviors of everybody except the extremists. And I don't think that's a useful way to do it. I don't think it's a rigorous and scholarly way to do this. For platforms, so there's a focus, we're obviously have a focus on online here, and it may be difficult to see the application of a lot of what I've been saying online, but really understanding these things is important to understanding how platforms can identify extremist content and create policies against it and moderate it. So again, for platforms, have the same problem, double of what academics have. So they have public opinions, the social norms are fickle, they change rapidly, and the companies are under constant pressure to constantly adapt to new problems as they come up in a way that the academy is not. So the current practices that the companies use for this process is ad hoc, which means that if there are a bunch of bad headlines and news stories, then they immediately change their policy. That's not a good way to do things. It's chaotic. It's better to have clear, stable definitions. There are always going to be exceptions. The companies are always going to respond to bad headlines, but if they're starting from a place of amorphous understanding of what extremism is, then they're destined to fail in providing a fair and structured approach. Finally, implications for governments, what we see in the United States, what just happened in Italy, what we're seeing in Europe, we're seeing in Australia to some possibly lesser extent. I'm not as much an expert on that polity as I am on some of these others, but certainly here in the United States, we're seeing a rise of extremism in the mainstream of society. Regimes and the polities, in the sense of the beliefs of the population, can change rapidly. People who are good faith actors in this space, in law enforcement and intelligence, they benefit from having a clear, stable definition. Bad faith actors would benefit from vague definitions so that they can just say whatever group that they want to persecute this week is extremist. And we see this all the time. The label of extremism is used in a very highly politicized manner to target minorities. And so that's a reason for us to pursue better definitions, more concrete definitions. And finally, I'll just say, we talk about fascism a lot in the United States right now. There is a movement that is pretty demonstrably fascist rising in the United States. Fascism is not synonymous with extremism, but it incorporates extremist beliefs and instrumentalizes them. So, a fascist leader may be quite cynical or not believe this stuff at all, but they're using it in the sake of power because they believe that people are using it. So I think that is the time we have allotted for me talking nonstop, a mile a minute, and I think we can possibly go to Q&A now. And if there are no questions, then I'll just keep on talking.
Great, thanks, JM. And you've obviously done this before because you were right on the finish time to the minute. In fact, within 10 seconds. So well done, and thanks for a really thought-provoking presentation. That went a lot of different places. There is a question on there at the moment, and please keep your questions coming. I'm just going to kick off with a couple from the start. Be interested, JM, in your take on the online environment, particularly talking how you mentioned in your definition, your definitional discussion, that this is about undertaking hostile action. So in that sense, I guess the question is really around, is online extremism different, or is it actually a phenomena in its own right, or is it just a facilitator for an offline activity that occurs? And if it's either way, I guess I'd be interested in your role on the role social media has in giving rise to both either offline or online extremism.
Sure. So, the definition of extremism as requiring hostile action was partly derived from my experience in studying extremism online. So one class of definitions of extremism that I didn't get into in this presentation stipulates that extremism has to be violent. And there is some appeal to that, especially if you're a government official. Violence is something that you can easily prosecute. So defining extremism as inherently violent is a convenient way to make it a law enforcement problem. But the problem is that, as we see on the online environment, extremism not always violent. It can be harassment. It can be verbal. We also see extremism plays out in discrimination, in economic discrimination or housing discrimination, things that are, you can argue that all this stuff is violence. You can argue harassment is psychic violence and discrimination is psychic violence, but most of us understand violence as being physical violence. So extremism takes place on a spectrum. There are physical kinds of violence that happen, and there are non-physical kinds, and that's what a lot of the time what we're dealing with in sort of these online arenas. More broadly, I think that social media has been profoundly destabilizing on society, and I think it's certainly aggravated by the neglect of the leaders of these companies, but the problem, I think, is more inherent to the structure of social media. So social media and platforms are really predicated around likes and shares and comments. And, likes and shares and comments cause material to become more visible. It becomes amplified by algorithms, and likes and shares and comments are really kind of an instant in-group consensus tool. So what happens is there are a number of effects that this has. So, I mean, for one thing, it just allows you to really take the temperature of your in-group very quickly. But for another thing, it allows you to scale your in-group to your beliefs. So back, just a sort of the concept here is that you're fishing in a much larger pool. So if you're an extremist or you have any kind of weird belief or fringe belief or, weird hobby for that matter, the internet allows you to find other people who share that belief much more easily than you ever could before. So the example I often use is if you were a jihadist living in Peoria, Illinois in 1950, you would go your whole life without potentially meeting another jihadist or speaking to one. And now on the internet, it's no problem at all. You just get on, and like 5 minutes later, if you're a radical druid, you get on the internet, and in half an hour you've got 20 other people who want to plant trees with you. So it's really it's a discovery tool, and then it allows you to build a consensus that allows you to shape your view of reality. So, and for some people, the threshold for that is very low. If I post that the earth is flat and 50 people like that post or retweet it, then I might feel a sense of validation. I feel like, well, there's 50 people who agree with me, and 50 people can't be wrong. So, so this really kind of flash consensus, instant consensus gets much worse when we're dealing with the scales that happen online. So if you're in QAnon and you can get 1,000 people who like and share your post, or you can get 100,000 people who like and share your post, whatever crazy stuff it happens to be, and you just get that instant validation. So of course your view of reality is shaped by that. If 100,000 people think the same thing that I do, it's got to be right. So I think, we're really just beginning to grapple with the challenges that the online arena presents for extremism from a social perspective.
Yeah, great. Thanks for a really comprehensive answer, James. I have a question here from someone who's read your paper, your 2018 paper on Twitter, and found that obviously quite interesting. The question is, with the pandemics and the January 6th goings on in between, they're interested in hearing your views on the platform now, particularly this week with Kanye West's attack on the Jews, Elon Musk and his potential embrace of Russian propaganda, and also the potential of his buying Twitter.
Yeah, so the platform, certainly, like a lot of the 2018 alt-right paper, a lot of that activity has gone. It's been banished off to some extent. It's been moderated away to some extent by Twitter's, Twitter does not have the same infrastructure devoted to content moderation that Facebook and Google do, but they do have some, and they are, fairly assertive about knocking certain kinds of content off. So like QAnon content is very hard to find on Twitter directly anymore. Then we have a lot of marginal content that is either coming from a celebrity like Kanye West, or stuff that is hedged dog whistles, stuff that is designed to skirt moderation. There's still a lot of that happening. And because one of our major political parties in this country is engaged in this material, engaged in these kinds of coded messages and promoting this, it's becoming a much more difficult environment to do moderation in without things becoming immediately very controversial. If Elon Musk buys Twitter, almost all of the progress that we're talking about, here is going to be gone. He's made it pretty clear that his intent is to drastically scale back content moderation. He may, if he buys the company, if he actually buys the company, and if he sticks to that plan, he may have to reconsider it. It's not, this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are certainly European regulations that will pertain to the company that he will have to comply with or stop doing business in Europe. There's a lot of, he's also not, the company and is not, as a private entity, is much more insulated against public opinion, but it's not entirely insulated against public opinion. So there's no question that it's the environment's going to be a lot worse. It's got a lot more difficult to navigate, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to get meaningful moderation done under an Elon Musk Twitter. So as imperfect as the system is now, and I think, as the question suggests, the system is quite imperfect at the moment, it can get a lot worse. So.
Great, thanks, JM. We have a question here that builds on the first question that was asked, and the question is, wouldn't good faith actors benefit from a definition that is focused around violence, either in theory or practice, as a core indicator? Otherwise, don't you risk conflating disagreement and harassment and falling into someone else's influence operation?
Yeah, so, there's, my feeling on this is that by limiting the behavior of extremists to violence, we're missing out on a couple of key things. So first, if you look at like groups that do organized harassment, racial harassment, kind of mobbing and trolling online, what you can see is that their dynamics, their arguments, and their conceptual stuff and their behaviors offline are not really that different from, in principle, structurally, from those who endorse violence. They're just not doing violence. Violence is a tactical consideration. So a movement may adopt violence or renounce violence or pause violence based on a lot of tactical considerations that are not really ideological in nature. They may just say, look, we did this violence and now it's losing us public support, so we're going to tone back the violence. Or they could say, well, we did this violence and it's gaining us public support, so we're going to do a lot more violence. The point is that it's not necessarily inherent to things they believe in and the concepts, how they orient themselves. So I think that you have to, where exactly you draw the line as far as taking remedial action is a much more interesting conversation than whether we could call it extremism. So in my book and in some of my other publications, I sort of talk about a spectrum of behavior that, goes from, segregation, voluntary segregation and harassment to all the way up to genocide. And, we can understand extremism as being a spectrum that includes all of these behaviors, but we don't have to take remedial action against all of these behaviors. We make, informed decisions about where we're going to draw lines. So, personally, I think for harassment, there are obviously different kinds of harassment. Some kinds of harassment can be considered criminal if people are sending mean tweets or harassing tweets or using racial slurs. I certainly think that a remedial action for that is to kick them off the platform in which they're doing that. That seems like a proportionate thing. That doesn't mean we should send them to jail, unless they're trying to instigate violence against somebody in a more kind of concrete and organized way. So we make decisions all the time about how we're going to react to these things and how we're going to take it, what kind of action we're going to take to try and control it, and what kind of action what kind of action is appropriate. And I think that, we can have a really robust conversation about where to draw those lines, but we can still understand that, 1,000 people getting together to hurl racial epithets at someone or to harass a woman online for being a woman, I think, we can understand that as extremism, even if we don't necessarily send a drone strike to take out the person who's doing it.
Thanks, James. I've got a question here from someone in Malaysia who's asking, back in my country, there are a few groups of religious extremists, but they are non-violent actors. They intend to mislead and misunderstand people regarding religious beliefs. The government take proactive measures by banning this group and arresting them. However, this group is still active. In your opinion and experience, what is the best approach to counter this problem?
Well, so this is to some extent the battle against extremism is the human condition. So we're never going to completely win. We're never going to completely eradicate movements. I'm not really a fan of banning groups that are not taking really kind of demonstrable hostile action. So you can be like, having a sort of pre-extremist orientation where you like really just want to be with your own kind. I would consider, like, self-segregation, for instance, if you're like creating a town that is really only for your religious believers and nobody else, or if you're trying to police your neighborhood to make sure that people are wearing the right clothes or doing the right practices. I think that those are clearly extremist activities. Certainly, I hesitate to be too sweeping, in my assessment of how other cultures handle these things. But I don't think that, the banned groups kind of approaches they have some advantages and they have a lot of disadvantages. That said, we're not doing a real good job here of controlling our extremist movements, who are these sort of edge movements, similar comparable edge movements like the Oath Keepers or the 3%ers, where they're not typically engaged in violence. Sometimes they do break out into violence, but most of the people involved with those groups are not violent on a day-to-day basis, but they're constantly thinking about and talking about violence, and we don't arrest people for being part of those groups. And I think that that's probably the right call, but we'll see how things turn out here over the next couple of years. I think, we're trying a suite of things. There's a lot of CVE work being done now that is starting. CVE sort of started off, 5-10 years ago, 15 years ago, as a boondoggle. It was a lot of money being thrown at a problem without very good definitions. A lot of people collected a lot of money and made a lot of money doing it. And, a lot of problems didn't get solved. I think that now we have more than a decade of work on this, that people are starting to understand the importance of evaluating relevant metrics. So, a lot of the old CVE stuff was just like, how many kids did we get to come to a soccer game? How many people showed up for a town hall? How many retweets did we get? And people are starting to really kind of devise and implement metrics that are really much more related to, are we preventing violence? Anybody can get engagement on a social media post, but are you preventing violence? And so it's a slow process, but I do think that, based on conversations I have with a lot of really smart people who are working in the space, I think that we are making incremental progress on this. Ultimately, my recommendation to people is that if you can find ways to reduce uncertainty or cushion societies against uncertainty is the best way you can get out ahead of these problems. So if you see that an economic disruption is coming, you figure out how to prepare for it. You figure out how to cushion the impact on people to reduce their uncertainty, not necessarily to reduce their pain. Poverty doesn't cause extremism, but sudden poverty, if you're a wealthy country that suddenly becomes poor, you're going to see extremism because of the uncertainty that creates, because nobody knows how to live through it and survive it. So I would argue probably the UK is really a cauldron right now that's going to have some problems. So, as much as we can anticipate those things, as we can address the sources of uncertainty and not not make the mistakes we've made before, like associating poverty with causing extremism, or associating a lack of education with causing extremism, but look at the things that cause uncertainty rather than the things that cause pain, because a society that's feeling pain doesn't necessarily tilt towards extremism, but a society that's experiencing uncertainty may.
Yeah, thanks, Jamin. I think leading on from that, your answer to that question, we're really interested in, you've given us a great journey through how social identity theory can help us to understand the rise of extremism and how it works. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on how that can help us to not just understand it, but what use can it have in addressing it as well. And at the risk of asking you to solve the US's domestic problems, I'd be really interested in, for example, how might that apply to something like the January 6th?
Yeah, so I think certainly in the aspect of social identity theory, a subfield of social identity theory that I think is really useful. There are two that I think are really useful. One is called Uncertainty Identity Theory by Michael Hogg. And that is sort of a lot of the basis of a lot of my arguments about uncertainty causing extremism. So the research on that and the writing on that does sort of talk about how we can seek to help people resolve uncertainty in healthier ways. The second piece is called system justification theory, and that's a bit more complicated in terms of how it plays out here. It's by John Jost. And the argument of system justification theory is that people will seek to justify the status quo, and they will resist efforts to change the status quo. And to such an extent, where social identity theory comes into it, is that people will justify the status quo even if it's bad for their in-group. So they will practice out-group favoritism if it's reinforcing the status quo. And this came about as an effort to explain why some minority people in the United States support policies and parties that do not love them. So in as much as we can sort of take these insights and try and use them to nudge people in the right direction, I think it's important. But you also run the risk, at some point, and this is a risk in the social media space too, is at some point you're trying to do social engineering, and that's an unproven discipline, and it's also a bit unsavory. And so it's very tricky. With the January 6th insurrection in the United States and the rising domestic extremist / fascist tide here, it's even more complicated, because what we have here is there's a large well-funded media apparatus that is devoted to reinforcing these messages. And the thing that sinks a lot of societies is that you have a charismatic leader of the extremist movement in Donald Trump. And our society is not well situated to push back on that figure. We have a political system that is designed that in its kind of prima facie alleged orientation is to protect minorities, but in fact what it is currently doing is kind of enshrining the minority rule. So we have that system that is extremely vulnerable to manipulation by a large movement like the movement that Donald Trump commands. And we have an opposition party that I think frequently fails to understand the gravity of the situation. So I am deeply concerned about the direction of this country over the next 2 years. And, I think it's really, it's just a full out, we're just going to have to make a full out assault on this from every direction. We have to go out there and be trying to establish facts. We're trying to debunk lies. We're trying to build bridges in communities, and we're trying to fight the subversion of our institutions. And it's a lot. I wish there was a silver bullet kind of answer to it, but there really isn't. And it's just going to be a lot of people carrying a lot of water for the next 2 years for an uncertain outcome.
Yeah, thanks, James. And sorry to end on such a